There are no Egyptian records of the Exodus. Not one. Not a single papyrus, stele, inscription, or administrative log from any period of ancient Egyptian history records the departure of hundreds of thousands of Hebrew slaves. The 10 plagues, the death of every firstborn Egyptian child, or the catastrophic destruction of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. Egypt was a civilization that recorded everything: grain yields, flood levels, military defeats, the price of fish, the dimensions of a tomb, the name of a horse. The bureaucratic apparatus of the New Kingdom was among the most sophisticated record-keeping systems the ancient world ever produced. In that archive, which has survived in substantial form across 3,000 years of burial in dry desert sand, the Exodus leaves no mark. That fact has been visible to scholars for more than a century. The question worth sitting with is why most people were never told what it means. If the Exodus did not happen the way Scripture describes, if the evidence against it is not marginal or ambiguous but systematic and overwhelming, then the foundational event of 3 of the world's major religions rests on something far more unstable than most believers have been invited to examine. The Exodus is not a footnote. It is the hinge on which the entire covenant theology of the Hebrew Bible turns. Remove it or substantially revise it, and you are not making a minor adjustment to a peripheral story. You are reopening a question that powerful institutions have spent centuries working to close. But here is where the chronology becomes structurally fatal, and you need to hold this point precisely. Pi-Ramesses was abandoned around 1070 BCE, when the Tannitic branch of the Nile silted up and the city lost its river access. The population relocated to Tanis, not merely relocated. The stones, the colossal statues, the architectural elements of Pi-Ramesses were physically dismantled, moved, and re-erected at the new location. Tanis was built from the bones of Pi-Ramesses. The original site became a ruin. If you use the 15th century date for the Exodus, preferred by some conservative scholars reading 1 Kings chapter 6, literally, which places the Exodus 480 years before Solomon's temple construction, around 1446 BCE. Then Pi-Ramesses had not yet been built when the Hebrew slaves were supposedly constructing it. The city did not exist. If you use the 13th century date preferred by the majority of mainstream scholars, fitting Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, then the city was indeed under construction during that era, but was abandoned and physically dismantled roughly 150 years later, leaving no evidence of the Hebrew labor force that Scripture places at its foundations. The name in the text is not an anchor. It is a problem. It has been a documented problem for 50 years. The second contradiction is demographic, and it is, if anything, more decisive than the first. The Book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 37, states that approximately 600,000 men left Egypt on foot, not counting women and children. Standard interpretive traditions working from this figure produce a total migrating population of between 2 and 3 million people. This is not a number in the margins of the text. It is stated plainly. Entire theological traditions, the motif of a nation formed in the wilderness, the scale of the divine provision of manna and quail, the organizational structure of 12 tribes moving as a coherent people, depend on this number being approximately correct. The grandeur of the Exodus narrative is inseparable from the scale the text assigns it. The Sinai Peninsula is not large. It covers approximately 60,000 square kilometers of desert, substantially inhospitable, with water sources that are few in number, documented in their locations, and fixed. Environmental archaeologists have estimated the Sinai's carrying capacity, the maximum population a given environment can sustainably support under pre-modern conditions, at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people at any given time. You cannot move 2 to 3 million people with their livestock through the Sinai for 40 years without consuming every available water source, exhausting every grazing area, and depositing an enormous and archaeologically traceable material record. Campsites leave fire rings, animal bones, and ash layers. People who die leave burials. Broken pottery is the most indestructible artifact of human occupation known to archaeology. 2 million people, living and moving and dying across a finite landscape for 4 decades, would leave behind a signature that no subsequent geological process could plausibly erase. The survey was conducted. In the 1970s and 1980s, Israeli archaeologist Eliezer Oren carried out a systematic survey of the northern Sinai corridor, the route the Egyptian military used and near which the biblical Exodus movement would have passed. Simultaneously, a comprehensive survey of the entire Sinai Peninsula was conducted in connection with archaeological work coordinated around the return of the Sinai to Egypt following the Camp David Accords. These surveys were thorough and professionally executed. They found evidence of human occupation going back thousands of years: Bronze Age settlements, Egyptian military forts, Nabatean trade routes, late Bronze Age material culture in abundance. What they did not find anywhere on the peninsula was evidence of a late Bronze Age nomadic encampment of anything approaching the biblical scale. Not a campfire ring attributable to an Israelite encampment. Not a midden heap. Not a burial ground. Not a single potsherd that could be assigned to a migrating Israelite population, moving through the region between 1446 and 1200 BCE. Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University and Neil Asher Silberman, writing in their landmark 2001 work, The Bible Unearthed, state this finding without qualification. The archaeological evidence simply does not support a mass migration through the Sinai of anything approaching the biblical scale. This is not a question of poor preservation. Egyptian material culture from the same period and the same region survives in abundance. The military forts along the northern route have been excavated and catalogued. Trade routes show continuous material evidence across millennia. The silence in the Sinai is not geological, it is historical, and what it says cannot be talked around. The third contradiction concerns not what the Israelites left behind, but the place they were entering. Canaan in the late Bronze Age was not a free territory waiting to be settled. Canaan was an Egyptian province. It had been an Egyptian province since at least the military campaigns of Thutmose III in the 15th century BCE, and remained so through the 13th and into the 12th century. Egyptian garrisons occupied the major cities, Megiddo, Beth Shean, Gaza, and Jaffa among them. Egyptian administrative centers collected taxes, resolved local disputes, and corresponded with the royal court. The regional governors of Canaanite city-states were vassals of the Pharaoh. The documentation for this is not circumstantial. In 1887, a cache of diplomatic correspondence was discovered at Amarna in Egypt. Clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, representing the correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of Canaan and other Near Eastern states during the 14th century BCE. The Amarna letters, now distributed across several major museum collections and extensively published, provide extraordinary detail about the political situation in Canaan under Egyptian administration. The Canaanite rulers describe their loyalty to the Pharaoh, their disputes with neighboring city-states, and their requests for Egyptian military reinforcement against internal threats. They describe a region completely integrated into the Egyptian imperial system. What this means for the Exodus narrative is direct and has no easy resolution. The Israelites, according to the biblical account, escaped Egyptian slavery by crossing the wilderness and entering Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, distinct from and opposed to the Egypt they had fled. What the evidence shows is that Canaan for most of the period in which the Exodus is traditionally placed, was administered by the same bureaucratic authority from which the Israelites were supposedly escaping. The Egyptian garrisons in Canaan reported to the same court that had enslaved them. The administrative system that had organized their labor in the Delta governed the land they were entering as free people. You cannot liberate yourself from an empire by walking into its provincial administration. The geography of the Exodus, as narrated, makes the theological transformation it describes historically incoherent against the documented political map. The fourth contradiction is written in the excavated soil of Canaan itself, and it concerns the conquest that the Exodus narrative makes possible. The book of Joshua narrates a systematic military campaign by which Israelite tribes, under Joshua's command, destroyed the major Canaanite city-states and took possession of the land. The narrative is specific. Jericho falls after the walls collapse at the sound of the priest's trumpets. Ai is burned. Hazor is destroyed by fire. The campaign is presented as both divinely authorized and historically concrete. Jericho has been excavated more thoroughly and by more successive teams of archaeologists than almost any other ancient site in the Levant. Kathleen Kenyon's definitive excavations in the 1950s established what the stratigraphic record shows. Jericho had no significant occupation and no defensive walls during the Late Bronze Age, the period in which the conquest is set. The city was either unoccupied or inhabited only as a small, unwalled settlement. Kenyon did find evidence of an impressive Middle Bronze Age fortification, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, and there is evidence that this earlier structure experienced violent destruction. But the destruction at Middle Bronze Age Jericho predates the proposed conquest by anywhere from 1 to 3 centuries, depending on which date for the Exodus you use. The walls that fell at Jericho, in the archaeological record, fell at the wrong time. AI presents a problem that is starker still. The site traditionally identified with Ai, Et Tel, located east of Bethel, shows no occupation whatsoever between approximately 2400 BCE and the Iron Age, around 1200 BCE. There was no city at Ai during the Late Bronze Age. The book of Joshua, chapter 8, describes in specific tactical detail the military feints and ambushes Joshua used to take and burn Ai. The archaeological record of Et Tel says that during the entire period the conquest narrative covers, the site was an uninhabited ruin from a city abandoned more than a millennium before Joshua was born. Some scholars have proposed alternative site identifications, but those proposals remain contested and without excavated support. The identification problem itself has been documented since the early 20th century. Hazor offers what looks, initially, like a partial exception, and the evidence deserves precise handling. Hazor does display evidence of violent destruction in the 13th century BCE. Burned layers, collapsed architecture, smashed cult objects. But Hazor is one of many sites across the eastern Mediterranean showing similar destruction profiles from the same general period. The Bronze Age collapse, occurring roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE, produced widespread destruction across the entire region. The end of the Hittite Empire, the destruction of Ugarit, the collapse of Mycenaean palace culture. Multiple Canaanite sites show destruction in this period as part of a regional pattern, rather than a targeted campaign. Attributing Hazor's destruction specifically to the forces of Joshua, rather than to the generalized catastrophe of the Bronze Age collapse, requires selecting one explanation from several without compelling specific evidence for the choice. The fifth contradiction concerns the Israelites themselves, not what they left, and not the cities they were supposedly conquering, but what they looked like when they arrived. If the Israelites were a distinct people forged by the Exodus experience, by generations of slavery in Egypt, by 40 years in the Sinai desert, by the covenant at Sinai and the identity it conferred. Then their material culture upon arriving in Canaan should be distinguishable from the culture they were displacing. They should carry traces of Egypt, pottery forms, amulets, burial customs, administrative practices absorbed through proximity. Or they should show evidence of a distinct nomadic culture formed in the Sinai, materially different from the settled Canaanite agricultural world. The archaeology shows neither. The early Israelite settlements appearing in the central highlands of Canaan from around 1200 BCE onward. The small hilltop villages most archaeologists accept as the founding settlements of the Israelite population are not materially distinguishable from Canaanite settlements of the same period. The pottery repertoire is shared. The architectural forms are largely the same. The religious objects recovered from these early Israelite sites include female figurines of a type associated throughout the region with Canaanite religious practice, specifically with Asherah, the goddess who appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible itself as the primary object of forbidden worship, meaning that even the text acknowledges how pervasive Canaanite religious practice was among the early Israelite population. William Dever, the American archaeologist who spent decades in the field specifically looking for material evidence that would support the biblical historical narrative, arrived at a conclusion he had not sought. Across works published from the 1990s onward, including Who Were the Early Israelites and Where Did They Come From?, Dever argues that early Israel emerged largely from within Canaanite society, from pastoral nomads transitioning to settled agriculture, from displaced peasant populations, from the lowland city-states disrupted by the Bronze Age collapse, from a gradual social formation within the highlands, rather than from an incoming population of former Egyptian slaves. The material culture of the earliest Israelite settlements is consistent with this reconstruction, and inconsistent with an origin in Egypt or the Sinai. Dever began his career as a defender of the biblical historical framework. His conclusions represent the kind of intellectual honesty that is rarer than it should be. The sixth contradiction is the oldest and in some ways the most structurally significant. It concerns not the soil of Canaan or the administrative records of Egypt, but the documentary character of the biblical text itself. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which include Exodus, is not a unified composition written by a single author close in time to the events it describes. The internal evidence for compositional complexity has been analyzed since at least the 18th century. John Astruc, a French physician, noted in 1753 that the alternating use of different names for God in Genesis, Elohim in some passages, Yahweh in others, pointed to the use of multiple underlying source documents. This observation was systematized by Julius Wellhausen in his 1878 work, Prolegomena to the History of Israel, which proposed that the Pentateuch combines at least 4 distinct documentary sources: the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly source, each with distinct theological concerns, vocabularies, and periods of composition. The documentary hypothesis has been debated, revised, and refined in the century and a half since Wellhausen, but its core finding, that the Pentateuch is a composite text assembled from sources with different theological agendas and different historical contexts, represents the working assumption of the discipline of Old Testament studies at major research universities worldwide. The priestly source, which shapes much of the Exodus narrative as it now stands, providing the precise chronological framework, the genealogies, the detailed ritual regulations, shows systematic theological characteristics that scholars including Richard Elliott Friedman, in his 1987 work, Who Wrote the Bible?, date to the period of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. What this means specifically: the Exodus narrative, in the form most people know it, was substantially composed or edited by a priestly class writing during or after one of the most traumatic events in Israelite history: the Babylonian conquest, the destruction of the temple, the deportation of the Israelite elite. In that context, the construction of a grand national origin story, a story in which this people had once been enslaved and had been liberated by divine power, had received a covenant that defined their singular identity, had been promised a land, served a coherent ideological and theological function. It was the work of a community in crisis, reaching back into its collective memory and its earlier documents, and assembling from that material an account of identity and destiny suited to a moment of existential threat. This does not make it fabrication in a simple sense, but it explains the shape of the narrative and helps account for the absence of the corroborating historical evidence that a document closer to the events would be expected to produce. This is not a fringe interpretation. Bart Ehrman, professor at the University of North Carolina, and one of the most widely read scholars of ancient religious texts writing for general audiences, addresses these compositional questions in accessible terms. Richard Elliott Friedman provides the most thorough and readable account of the source analysis. The scholarship is extensive, publicly available, and largely settled among academic specialists. The gap between what specialists know and what most people have been taught represents a decision made by institutions with interest in the matter, about which knowledge to circulate widely and which to allow to remain in academic journals and university classrooms. There are serious scholars who argue for a historical kernel within the Exodus narrative, and their arguments deserve honest engagement. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer, In Israel in Egypt, documents the presence of genuine Egyptian linguistic and cultural details in the Exodus text. The name Moses is Egyptian in origin, derived from the word element meaning son of, as in Tutmose or Amose. The names Phinehas, Hopni, and Merari in the biblical text are identifiably Egyptian in form. The description of Egyptian administrative practices in the Delta shows familiarity with details a later writer working without Egyptian sources would be unlikely to invent. Some scholars have proposed that the Exodus tradition may preserve historical memory of a smaller group, perhaps a few hundred or a few thousand Egyptian-influenced people of Semitic origin, whose experience was later expanded and theologized into a national origin narrative for a much larger population that had a different history entirely. Something may have happened. That is a defensible scholarly position. But something may have happened is not the same as 2 million people crossed the Sinai, built a city whose archaeological record shows no trace of their presence, and conquered a land that the evidence shows was never theirs to conquer in the way the narrative describes. Here is where all 6 contradictions converge. The absence of Egyptian documentation for an event of the scale described, the demographic impossibility of the stated numbers against the carrying capacity of the Sinai, and the total lack of archaeological trace along the migration route. The presence of Egyptian administrative authority over the very land the Israelites were entering. The non-destruction, and in some cases non-existence of the cities the conquest narrative describes as destroyed. The material indistinguishability of early Israelite culture from the Canaanite culture it was supposedly displacing. The composite and late documentary character of the text itself, shaped by a priestly class writing centuries after the events it narrates. These 6 points do not stand in isolation. They reinforce one another. They form a coherent evidential pattern. Together they constitute a case that, in any other domain of historical inquiry, would be treated as decisive. The majority consensus among working archaeologists and biblical scholars who study these questions professionally, a consensus that includes Jewish, Christian, and secular scholars at institutions across Israel, Europe, and North America is that the Exodus, as narrated in Scripture, is a theological and national origin myth rather than a historical event of the scale and character the text describes. This conclusion has been reached not by people hostile to religion, but by people who followed the evidence with professional rigor and reported what it showed. What this means for you, specifically, is a question worth sitting with. 3 of the world's major religions have constructed foundational theological claims about the nature of divine action in history, about covenant and election, about the moral obligations that flow from the experience of liberation, on a narrative whose historical form the evidence does not support at the scale those traditions require. The Passover Seder, observed annually by Jewish communities worldwide, reenacts a historical departure whose archaeological signature does not exist. Liberation theology, which drew its most urgent political metaphors from the Exodus, built a theology of social justice on an event whose historical form is deeply contested. The Christian typological reading of Moses as a prefiguration of Christ builds theological architecture on the same contested foundation. The Islamic reverence for Musa draws from the same tradition. None of this tells you what to believe. The meaning a tradition carries is not dissolved by archaeology. Myths carry truths that historical records cannot contain. The question of what the Exodus means as a story about human longing for freedom, about divine solidarity with the suffering, about the possibility of deliverance. None of those questions are settled by stratigraphy. But you were given this story as history. You were told that the events it describes happened in the physical world at a scale that made them the founding events of civilization's moral architecture. You were not given the excavation reports alongside the narrative. You were not told about the Sinai surveys, or the Amarna letters, or Kenyon's findings at Jericho, or the empty ruin of Et Tel, or the compositional dating of the priestly source to the Babylonian exile. The information was available. It was published in accessible works by credentialed scholars at major universities. The distribution was not equal. The access was not equal. That inequality was not an accident. The most telling absence in the story of the Exodus is not the one in the Egyptian administrative record. It is the absence of this conversation in the places where it was most needed. For the longest time, that conversation has been happening in excavation reports and academic journals and university classrooms for the better part of a century. If you are arriving at it now, that itself is a fact worth examining. Ask yourself who controlled the door. Ask yourself how long it was held closed, and in whose interest. The record, in all its silence, in all its contradiction, in all its painstaking archaeological honesty, has been waiting for precisely this question. There is a deeper layer to each of these contradictions that the surface summary does not fully capture, and the evidence rewards closer examination. Take the question of Egyptian silence again, because the shape of that silence is instructive. When the Egyptians lost battles, they recorded them selectively, with the loss reframed as a moral victory or attributed to the treachery of enemies, but recorded nonetheless. Ramesses II, the pharaoh most commonly proposed as the Exodus pharaoh, fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites in 1274 BCE, and effectively fought to a draw. Egyptian accounts of Kadesh are preserved on temple walls across Egypt, at Luxor, Karnak, the Ramesseum, and Abu Simbel. They present the outcome as an Egyptian triumph, which it was not, but they record the event. The Egyptians also documented the Hyksos, a Semitic people who had occupied the Delta region and ruled northern Egypt for roughly a century before being expelled around 1550 BCE. That expulsion is documented. The Hyksos are recorded. They left an archaeological signature in the Delta region. The 10 plagues, if they occurred, would have been the most catastrophic sequence of events in Egyptian recorded history. The death of the firstborn across an entire nation, the destruction of crops and livestock, the darkening of the sun for 3 days, an epidemic of boils and disease, the collapse of the Nile's biological ecosystem through the blood plague. These events, occurring in a civilization that recorded the height of the Nile's annual flood to the centimeter for administrative purposes, would have left a documentary and probably an archaeological record of extraordinary proportions. The complete absence of any such record is not the kind of silence that administrative incompleteness or the passage of time can plausibly explain. It is not even the kind of silence that is consistent with Egyptian practices of suppressing unflattering information, because Egyptian records that acknowledge military setbacks, crop failures, and political instability in other periods survive in the archive. The plagues leave nothing. The issue of the 600,000 also deserves a specific kind of extended attention, because the number is not merely logistically impossible, it is internally inconsistent with other parts of the biblical narrative. The Book of Numbers, chapters 3 and 4, records a census of the Israelite tribes in the wilderness. If 600,000 fighting men implies a total population of 2 to 3 million, then the Israelite population in Egypt before the Exodus must have been comparable, or somewhat smaller. The book of Exodus itself, chapter 1, describes the growth of the Israelite population as so dramatic that Pharaoh felt threatened by it, which requires a substantial starting population. But then, the narrative also describes the entire midwifery service to the Hebrew population as consisting of 2 women, Shiphrah and Puah, 2 midwives serving a population that, at the trajectory implied by the later census figures, should have numbered in the hundreds of thousands or more. The internal numerical logic of the Exodus narrative does not hold together even on its own terms. Independent of archaeological evidence, the inconsistency was noticed and commented on by medieval Jewish scholars working within the tradition. It is not a modern skeptical invention. Some proposed allegorical or symbolic readings of the numbers. Some proposed different Hebrew words that might mean something other than literal thousands. The numbers have always been a difficulty for careful readers. The political geography problem, Canaan as an Egyptian province, is one that the biblical narrative itself acknowledges in a limited way, without following through on its implications. Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18, explicitly states that God did not lead the Israelites along the coastal road through Philistine territory, even though that was the more direct route, because God feared they would turn back when they saw the prospect of war. The coastal road was precisely the route along which the Egyptian military maintained its network of forts, the forts that Eliezer Oren's survey identified and excavated. The narrative avoids the military road, steering the people into the wilderness instead. This detail, read in context, functions as a narrative acknowledgement that the coastal route was dangerous because it was Egyptian-controlled. But the wilderness route converged on Canaan, which was also Egyptian-controlled, administered by the same imperial apparatus. The problem was not solved by the route chosen. It was simply deferred until it became invisible in the narrative. The question of what was actually happening in the Canaanite highlands around 1200 BCE, during the period when the first proto-Israelite villages appear, is one of the most actively researched questions in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, and the research picture has become considerably more nuanced than the binary it is often presented as. Finkelstein's proposal of an internal Canaanite origin for early Israel has been refined and partially challenged by scholars, who note that some of the highland settlers did show material cultural practices, particularly the avoidance of pig bones in their food refuse, that differentiated them from lowland Canaanite populations. The pig avoidance is significant because it suggests a dietary practice that, while it could have multiple explanations, is consistent with a population that identified as ethnically or religiously distinct from its Canaanite neighbors. This does not establish Egyptian origin. It does suggest that whatever the process of early Israelite formation was, it involved some form of group identity formation that distinguished this population from its neighbors. The debate between those who see early Israel as primarily an internal Canaanite development and those who allow for a small-scale outside contribution continues. What does not continue as a defensible position in this debate is the 2 million-person Exodus as a historical event. The compositional question about the biblical text is also richer than a simple summary of the documentary hypothesis can convey. One of the most striking features of the priestly source's contribution to the Exodus narrative is its systematic use of precise chronological markers, giving exact dates for events in a way that creates the impression of a contemporaneous historical record, while the dates themselves are almost certainly schematic and symbolic rather than archival. The 480 years between the Exodus and the founding of Solomon's Temple in 1 Kings chapter 6 is a number that can be read as 12 generations of 40 years each, a clearly symbolic framework rather than a calendrical calculation. The ages given for the patriarchs in the genealogies of the priestly source follow patterns that are recognizable as literary and theological constructions rather than demographic records. The priestly source is doing something with chronology, but what it is doing is not the same thing a contemporaneous administrative scribe would be doing with dates. The broader question of what the Exodus narrative was for, what social and theological function it performed for the communities that produced and preserved it, is one that scholars across multiple disciplines have engaged with seriously. Jan Assmann, the German Egyptologist and cultural theorist, has written extensively on what he calls the Mosaic distinction, the theological and cultural innovation associated with the Exodus tradition, of insisting on an absolute distinction between true and false religion, between the one God who demands exclusive loyalty and the gods of other nations. In his reading, the Exodus narrative carries enormous cultural force, not because of its historical accuracy, but because of the categorical distinctions it establishes and the way those distinctions have shaped the subsequent history of monotheistic religion. The power of the narrative, in this analysis, is inseparable from its function as a founding myth. A myth, in the technical sense, meaning a narrative that establishes and legitimizes the categories through which a community understands itself and its relationship to the world. This is, ultimately, what the 6 contradictions add up to. Not a debunking of religious experience, not a proof that nothing happened, but a clear-eyed account of what the evidence shows and what it does not show, applied to a narrative that has been presented to billions of people as established historical fact, when the specialist disciplines that study it have reached a quite different conclusion. The gap between what the scholars know and what the congregations have been told is not a matter of ongoing dispute or legitimate uncertainty about the evidence. The evidence is reasonably clear. The dispute is about who gets to know it, and when, and in what context. If you found this examination useful, if you believe that this kind of careful engagement with evidence and scholarship belongs in the conversation that most people are actually having about their inherited traditions, then the question of where you find more of it matters. The scholarship cited here is real and publicly available. Finkelstein and Silberman's The Bible Unearthed is in print. Friedman's Who Wrote the Bible is in print. Hoffmeyer's Israel in Egypt is in print, for those who want the most rigorous conservative counterargument. The archaeological reports from Kantir, from the Sinai surveys, from Jericho and Ai and Hazor, are in the public scholarly record. This is not hidden knowledge. It is simply knowledge that has not been equally distributed. That unequal distribution is the last and perhaps most important thing to examine. It did not happen by accident. It was sustained by institutions with interests in the matter. And it is ending, not because those institutions have changed their interests, but because the information now moves in ways they cannot control. The absence in the Egyptian record is real. The absence in the Sinai soil is real. The absence of the walls at Jericho and the city of Ai is real. What is no longer absent is the conversation you were always owed. What follows is not an assault on faith. It is a forensic examination of the archaeological record, the documentary evidence, and the scholarly consensus that has quietly emerged over the past 4 decades in university departments and excavation reports that most people never read. The excavation reports exist. The population studies are real. The Egyptian administrative records have been translated and published. The stratigraphy of sites like Jericho and Ai has been documented in meticulous detail by archaeologists who, in several cases, began their careers hoping to confirm the biblical account. You deserve to see what they found. By the end of this, you will know exactly why the city of Ramesses, the very city the Bible says Hebrew slaves were forced to build, was abandoned and physically dismantled decades before the period in which the Exodus is traditionally set. That single archaeological fact does not merely complicate the story. It unravels the chronology entirely. It has been in the published record since the 1970s. The question of why that finding is not part of the standard account of the Exodus says as much about how knowledge is managed as it does about ancient history. Here is the first contradiction. The book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 11, names the cities the Israelites were forced to build: Pithom and Ramesses. The identification of Ramesses with the ancient site of Pi Ramesses, located in the eastern Nile Delta at modern Cantir, is not in scholarly dispute. Egyptologists agree on this point. The city was constructed under Ramses II, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE. This places the construction of Pi Ramesses squarely in the 13th century BCE. For generations of readers, this appeared to be powerful corroboration. The city named in the Bible exists. It is in the right part of Egypt. The era was one of intensive royal construction. The surface alignment between text and archaeology seemed, at first, to hold. Then the excavations went deeper. What archaeologists found at Cantir was not a record of Hebrew slaves. They found an Egyptian administrative capital of extraordinary scale, a royal city that may have housed 300,000 people at its height, complete with horse stables documented to hold more than 400 animals simultaneously, chariot workshops, weapons manufactories, granaries, temples, and administrative buildings covering several square kilometers. The labor records that have survived from this site and from comparable New Kingdom construction projects are precise. Egyptian state administration tracked workers by name, by trade, by ethnic origin, and by daily ration allocation. The ration lists, work logs, and overseer reports that have been recovered from Pi Ramesses and related sites list Egyptians, integrated Canaanites, and prisoners of war taken from Nubian and Libyan campaigns. None of these records reference a Hebrew labor force working under coercion. None of them. The silence in that administrative record is not the product of incomplete preservation. It is consistent. Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, who spent decades mounting the most rigorous scholarly defense of a historically plausible Exodus, and whose 2003 work on the reliability of the Old Testament represents the most comprehensive conservative argument for the narrative's historicity, acknowledged that direct textual evidence for Hebrew slave labor at Pi Ramesses does not exist in the Egyptian record. That acknowledgement came from one of the Exodus narrative's most committed scholarly defenders, working with full access to the primary documentation. Consider what it means when the most thorough advocate for your position concedes the evidentiary foundation is absent.